Amen. Powerful. What a powerful time of worshiping. We thank you so much to our praise band as well as our choir and musicians and everyone who led us in worship today. I hope you have been able to get a little bit lost in the words of the songs we've been singing and reflect on God and His goodness. Jesus Christ is our living hope. That is such a powerful message. Jesus Christ, the fact that He got up from the grave, tells us that death will no longer have a hold on us. And so if you think about it, the worst thing that this world can do to you, take your very life, will not hold you down. It will not keep you back. It won't hold you down because ultimately in Christ you have overcome that, and you will come out of that grave one day. Even the very thing that is the worst the world could do won't be enough to stop what God is doing if you have a relationship with Him through Jesus Christ. Thank you. That's a beautiful song to sing. If you're here today and you're a guest, I do want to welcome you. We're glad to have you here. If you're here maybe for the first time, or if you're here for the second time or the first time in a long time, we have a Connect card. It's in the inside of the bulletin. If you didn't stop by our guest table on the way in, we want to encourage you to fill that out. And you can just take it by the Welcome Center and just hand it in there to one of our welcome team members before you leave today on your way out. And they'll give you a gift from us as our way of saying thank you for choosing to come and worship with us and to be a part of our service today. So please be sure to do that. Now, a couple things to mention to you before we jump in to the scripture today. One is this week is a big week here at Lebanon Baptist Church because we have our Barnyard VBS this week. And so you thought we were a bunch of animals, and it's going to look like it this week, all right? And so this week we're going to have a lot of fun with this. And so if you haven't got your kid or your grandkid or someone you know registered for this, please be sure to do that. We're super excited about it. It'll be every night, Monday night through Friday night, ages 3 up through 8th grade. And so we're looking forward to that. We'll have a special time at the end today where we're going to ask our volunteers in VBS to come up, and we'll pray over all of them because we know they need it, and we'll dedicate this week to the Lord. We want to see people this week come to faith in Jesus Christ. Most come to faith in Jesus Christ before they get into high school, before they get out of high school. Most come to Christ as a kid. And so that's why we do VBS. That's why we do all of this work, is to try to introduce the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so we're praying for a wonderful, great, beneficial week this week. I want to ask you to pray for us and join us together as a church in doing that. Yesterday, we had a large group from our church that went out and handed out some of these door hangers. And so we had about 1,000 of these, and all but about 150 of these were handed out yesterday, and I think there's some couple youth leaders and some teens that are going to go out today and hand out the rest of these 150, inviting people to our VBS. And so we had a time of doing that yesterday. Some youth leaders, some teens, and some others from our church came out yesterday. We even had a special guest come help us yesterday. This is one of our missionaries right here, Dexter Kirby. Dexter is a friend of mine. We graduated from Piedmont together, and he is from the island of St. Vincent. He is a missionary in St. Vincent, where he's planted a church and is doing wonderful work of the Lord there in St. Vincent. And so he flew all the way up here just to help us with passing out these door hangers. He's actually in the States for a couple months, and he is on furlough. And so he was in Winston-Salem, and we met earlier this week. And then he heard that we were doing this, and so he wanted to come out and help us. He'll be here tonight. He'll actually be here tonight at 6 o'clock. And so this is him and his family, his 2 girls. They're going to all be here with us tonight, right here in the Family Life Center at 6 o'clock. So this is a missionary we support, and this church has been supporting for some time. And so tonight, he's going to be giving a special message at 6 right here. And so I hope you'll come out and be a part of that tonight at 6. Show your support for him and for their ministry and for their work. He came out and helped us yesterday, and I hope you'll come out tonight to hear God's doing some great things there. And we have an opportunity to be a part of some things there that he is doing. So I hope you'll come back tonight at 6 and be a part of that. All right, a couple more things to mention to you, all right? A couple more things to mention. This past year, this past school year, we had a unique opportunity present itself to us as a church. There was On Labor Day, there was a bus service in our area, in our community, that suddenly stopped working, just said we're going to stop immediately. And so what this bus service did was it transported, you may have seen the bus before in our church parking lot. They would pick up kids on this side of town and transport them across to the other side of town who were going to a charter school and didn't have transportation to get over there. It was hard for parents to do that. And so there were a lot on this side of town that were going to that. And then all of a sudden, the school year started. Things were going well. But then on Labor Day, an email was sent out, and a note was sent out to parents as well as to workers that were a part of this bus service that they were going to cease operations immediately. Like the next day, you'd have no transportation, and there were 5 or 6 employees would be out of jobs. And so this was a difficult thing. There were people in our church, families in our church that kind of depended upon this transportation service. There were people in our community that depended upon this transportation service. And so what we did was we found out about that on Tuesday morning, and I think it was by Thursday morning, we called 2 of the ladies in that were working, driving these buses on our side of town, from our side of town. We called them in and we talked to them about it. We figured out that we could take a little bit of a risk and step of faith, and we could use our own church vans to at least help meet some of that need for this past school year. We could keep these ladies employed, and we could keep the kids in our church and in our community with the transportation service that they depended upon. So that's what we did. And we took that kind of step of faith. We worked through a couple channels, and we worked it out. And the very next week, even before that week had ended, we were able to provide for that need for people here on our side. And so our church, Lebanon Baptist Church, was able to do that and be a part of that. We didn't know how it would go. We said, we'll take it kind of a week at a time, a month at a time, a semester at a time. We sort of committed to the end of December to just see how it would go. And then if it went well, we would try to continue it for the rest of the school year. And so that's what we did. Well, we've got enough demand and interest for this going into the next school year that we know we need a little bit more transportation in order to do this. And so one of the things that I'm excited about is that we as a deacon board, we sat, we met, and we talked about this a couple months ago and what we could possibly do. And so we've looked into some buses, because if we have a bus, we know we can transport more kids. And both of these drivers have CDLs in order to do that. And so we know we can transport more kids if we have a bus. And so we also know that our vans are getting in a little bit worse shape every single minute. And so we know that. And so if you've ever gone on one of these, whether you're a senior adult or a youth or a kids worker or kids, you know what it's like. And so one of the things we want to do is we'd like to purchase a bus in order to continue this ministry. In fact, just yesterday, one of the houses that I rang the doorbell of, the man came to the door, and as we were talking, he said, I heard about this transportation ministry that you guys did last school year. Is there room? Is there more room for that for the next school year? Because he has 2 kids that go to Cornerstone, that go to this school. And so I said, well, we're hoping to work out enough room to have more transportation because we've had more demands. And so we went this past week and we looked at a couple buses that look like this, used school buses. This is one that we looked at right here. And then this is another one that we looked at. And so we're trying to figure out how to get one of these. We actually like that one there a little bit better. But basically what we can do is somewhere between $6,000 to $12,000, we can get one of those. And so it just depends on us being able to come up with the money in order to do that. We already have the demand for this and for the ministry, and I think it's a great opportunity. And so I just want to tell you about that. I want you to be praying about that for us as we're considering this, hoping to be able to come up with the funds in order to do this. I know we're in a season right now of increased giving towards our 2020 and all of that. I'll mention that in a minute, but be praying for us in this. And if God lays it upon your heart, impresses it upon your heart to give to help us purchase something like this, come see me if that's something you would like to do. Come see me and talk to me, because we're hoping to be able to get this in a couple weeks' time if God provides the funding for it, so that we can begin planning for our fall and for the next school year to be able to do this. So will you join me in prayer for that and be praying for that and consider how you might be a part of that if God lays that on your heart. Also, financially speaking, I wanted to update everybody on where we are. We set ourselves a goal with our 2020 vision giving to be able to reach $400,000 by the end of the summer. So by the end of August, this is the goal that we're shooting for, to have seen that much given to our 2020 since we started giving to this. And so as of right now, we're at like a little over $386,000. And so over the next few weeks, we're praying that God will see us bless and allow us to reach that goal by the end of August. And so I wanted to just update you on where we are. We're excited about this. We're seeing some great things done. I think God is worthy of praise in all of this. Yeah. some great things happening. And so we give the Lord praise and thanks for all the things that he is doing here. Two other things to mention to you. One is we have someone in our church who is back in our church today who has spent several weeks at basic training for the Army. And so where is he at? He's over here somewhere. He's back today. Noah, would you stand up? This is Noah Watson. Would you thank him for his service? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. So I think he's here for a few days, and I know mom's happy and family's happy, everybody's happy, dad's happy, so we're glad to have you back. Thank you for your commitment to service to our country. And then also we have a couple who yesterday in our church experienced their 50th anniversary. And so Robert and Alice Staley, I think Alice is back here, and I want to embarrass you. Would you stand up and just let everybody see? They've been married 50 years. Yeah. Thank you. All right. It is a blessing. That is truly a blessing. Great things going on. So take your Bibles, though, now and turn to Genesis chapter 31. Genesis chapter 31. We're in our series on the life of Jacob called Redo. We're trying to learn how to live from the life of Jacob. Genesis chapter 31. Last week, we saw that sometimes obedience to God leads to opposition from others. Not everyone in our life that we're surrounded by, not everyone who is part of our family or part of our work family, even sometimes part of our church family or part of our friends or neighbors, not everybody around us responds positively to our obedience to God. Sometimes when we obey God, we face opposition. We looked at that last week, and we said that when we face opposition in obedience to God, what are we supposed to do? How do we respond to that? And I'm asking this question, and I want your response. It's a quiz. Keep working diligently and honestly. Keep working diligently and honestly when your obedience to God results in opposition. I'm glad people answered that quickly, because if not, I was going to have to conclude I need to preach longer in order to drive the point home more. And I know a lot of you would be happy with that, but we keep working honestly and we keep working diligently, but can we control the results? Can we control the outcome? We can't control the outcome. Who controls the outcome? God controls the outcome, and we trust the outcome to the hand of God. Sometimes we don't see God's hand working in our life. Sometimes we see the opposition that we're facing. But even in the story of Jacob, when he faced opposition, he didn't quit. He continued in his obedience to the Lord, and God took care of the results. Now, today, what we're going to see is we're going to see that there is a blessing that comes from God when we continue in our obedience. We're going to see that God blesses us when we continue to obey him, even in the face of opposition. I want to see specifically what that blessing is, and we're going to see how then we ought to respond. So last week, it was kind of like, hey, here's how we respond, and then we trust God to do his part. We do our part, which is when we face opposition and we're obedient, we do our part, and we keep working honestly and diligently, and then we trust God to take care of the results. Today, the text is kind of reversing that order, and the story we're going to see today shows us what God does when we continue in that, and then how we ought to secondly respond, again, as a part of what God is doing. So look at Genesis chapter 31 and verse 17. We're going to read verses 17 through the end of the chapter, and so I want you to follow along with me in your Bibles. Genesis 31, verse 17. Jacob is, by the way, decided that he is going to leave Haran. He's going to leave Laban. He's going to take his family and his flocks that God has blessed him with, and he's going to move back to the land of Canaan, the land of promise, the land of the blessing that he has been promised by God. So in verse 17 of Genesis 31, Jacob arose, and he set his sons and his wives on camels. He drove away all his livestock, all his property that he had gained, the livestock in his possession that he had acquired in Padan Aram, to go to the land of Canaan to his father Isaac. Laban, that's his father-in-law, Laban had gone to shear his sheep. And Rachel, it says, stole her father's household gods. And it says Jacob tricked Laban, the Aramean. Now, I think the word tricked is a poor translation. I'm using the ESV, and I think it's a poor translation of this text because it's a Hebrew idiom there that means he stole away the heart. And it can be translated a number of ways, but one of them is it can be translated as he just outsmarted, he outwitted, as opposed to tricked or deceived. And I think in the context, that's what's going on. So Jacob outwitted Laban, the Aramean, and he did that by not telling him that he intended to flee. He fled with all that he had and arose and crossed the Euphrates and set his face toward the hill country of Gilead. When it was told Laban on the third day that Jacob had fled, he took his kinsman with him and pursued him for 7 days. And it says, followed close after him into the hill country of Gilead. But God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream by night and said to him, look at God intervening, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. And Laban overtook Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country, and Laban with his kinsmen pitched tents in the hill country of Gilead. And Laban said to Jacob, what have you done, that you have tricked me and driven away my daughters like captives of the sword? Why did you flee secretly and trick me and did not tell me, so that I might have sent you away with mirth and songs, with tambourine and lyre? Why did you not permit me to kiss my sons and my daughters farewell? Now you have done foolishly. It is in my power to do you harm. But the God of your father spoke to me last night, saying, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. And now you have gone away because you longed greatly for your father's house. But why did you steal my gods? Jacob answered and said to Laban, because I was afraid, for I thought that you would take your daughters from me by force. Anyone with whom you find your gods shall not live. I mean, Jacob says, hey, we didn't take your household gods. Jacob doesn't know what Rachel's done. And so Jacob's saying, hey, if you find anybody here in my family with your household gods, they get the death sentence. They can't live. See, Jacob didn't know that. Rachel had them. Anyone with whom you find your God shall not live. In the presence of our kinsmen, point out what I have that is yours and take it. Like, I haven't taken anything that's yours. If you find anything here that I've taken as yours, he says, you can have it back. Take it. Now, Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen them. So Laban went into Jacob's tent and into Leah's tent and into the tent of the two female servants, but he did not find them. And he went out of Leah's tent and entered Rachel's. Now Rachel had taken the household gods and put them in the camel's saddle and sat on them. Laban felt all about the tent, but did not find them. And she said to her father, Let not my Lord be angry that I cannot rise before you, for the way of women is upon me. So he searched, but did not find the household gods. Then Jacob became angry and berated Laban. Jacob said to Laban, what is my offense? What is my sin that you have hotly pursued me? For you have felt through all my goods. What have you found of all your household goods? Set it here before my kinsmen and your kinsmen, that they may decide between us two. These 20 years, Jacob says, I have been with you. Your ewes and your female goats have not miscarried, and I have not eaten the rams of your flocks. What was torn by wild beasts I did not bring to you. I bore the loss of it myself. From my hand you required it, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. There I was by day, the heat consumed me, and the cold by night, and my sleep fled from my eyes. These 20 years I have been in your house. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters, and 6 years for your flock, and you have changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been on my side, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. God saw my affliction and the labor of my hands and rebuked you last night. Then Laban answered and said to Jacob, the daughters are my daughters. We actually see him sort of as a pouting, possessive, egocentric man that he is in this case. The daughters are my daughters, the children are my children, the flocks are my flocks, and all that you see is mine. That's Laban. Everything you see is mine. And Jacob just said, all the blessings that you've enjoyed were at my work because God blessed what I was doing. And Laban says, no, everything you see is mine. What is that? Show mine. I don't know why that's coming to hit. Anyway, that's why Nemo. Is that Nemo? Is that Finding Nemo? Who says that in that? The seagulls? Okay. That's one of those things anyway, it comes back at weird times. All right, here we go. Squirrel. Where are we at? Laban answered and said to Jacob, the daughters are my daughters, the children are my children, the flocks are my flocks, and all that you see is mine, 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 mine. But what can I do for this day for these my daughters, or for their children whom they have borne? Laban says, in essence, I can't do anything about it because God has intervened on your behalf. Come now, let us make a covenant, you and I, and let it be a witness between you and me. So Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar. And Jacob said to his kinsmen, gather stones. And they took stones and they made a heap, and they ate there by the heap. Laban called it Jegar Sarahutha, but Jacob called it Galeed. Laban said, this heap is a witness between you and me today. Therefore he named it Galeed and Mizpah, for he said, the Lord watch between you and me when we are out of one another's sight. They're making a peace treaty here. If you oppress my daughters, or if you take my wives besides my daughters, although no one is with us, see, God is witness between you and me. Laban's setting this whole thing up, this contract. Then Laban said to Jacob, see this heap and the pillar which I have set between you and me? This heap is a witness and the pillar is a witness that I will not pass over this heap to you, and you will not pass over this heap and this pillar to me to do harm. The God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us. So Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac, and Jacob offered a sacrifice in the hill country and called his kinsmen to eat bread. They ate bread and spent the night in the hill country. Early in the morning, Laban arose, and he kissed his grandchildren and his daughters and blessed them. Then Laban departed and returned home. What we see in the text today, what I want to flesh out for you as we try to unpack this and make some application, is that continued obedience to the will of God results in divine protection. It results in divine protection. And I think what we see in this case is it results in protection for Jacob and his family, even from the potential consequences of sin in his own camp. Rachel has taken and stolen these household gods and idols from her father, and certainly that was wrong, and Jacob didn't know about that, but God in his protection of Jacob and his family protected them because Jacob was continuing to obey God. Even though there were potential consequences for this sin, a death sentence was passed upon whoever would be found having these, and yet God protected them even in the midst of that. Jacob was unaware. A blessing, though, this is a blessing which should be gratefully acknowledged. That's our response. Now, let me unpack it for you. First of all, continued obedience to the will of God results in divine protection. It's important that we note in this text that Jacob is clearly moving and acting and behaving in response to and in obedience to the declared will of God. Okay? Jacob is doing all of this because God has told him to do this. In chapter 31, verse 13, chapter 31, back up to verse 13, God had said to Jacob, I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. So what does God say to Jacob? Now arise, go out from this land, and return to the land of your kindred. What does verse 17, the beginning of our text, say? So Jacob, what does it say? Arose. He rose up, or he arose. God said, arise, leave this land, go back to the land that I have promised you. Jacob does that. He rises up and he obeys, begins this process of obedience to God. There's an echo here, even going back to Genesis 12, with Jacob's grandfather. Jacob's grandfather, Abraham, moved from Haran back to Canaan, and he was one who did a very similar thing, collected all of the property he had gathered, and he set out in compliance to God's will. There's an echoing back to the obedience of Abraham in leaving Haran to go to Canaan, and there's an echo back to that. Jacob is doing the same thing. God said, arise, leave, go, and Jacob begins to arise and to leave and to go. Jacob is setting out quickly on this journey. Laban and his family, they're away. They're out from the home. They're way out shearing their sheep. And while they're doing that, Jacob decides it's time to go. And so they left quickly. The text tells us he set out quickly and he stole away from Laban's. But there's an interesting word used. There's a Hebrew word used instead of the one that means to deceive. There's another one used which points, I think, to Jacob's innocence in this. That, yeah, he's afraid of Laban. He knows Laban's not going to let him go easily. Laban hasn't really been the easiest guy to get along with. Anybody in here have a father-in-law like Laban hasn't been the easiest father-in-law to get along with. You know what I mean? It's kind of been tough. And he's swindled him and he's cheated him and he's made life hard on Jacob. 20 years he's been there with him. And so Jacob knows, this is not going to be easy. So he waits till Laban's away and he says, let's get out of here. Let's move quickly and let's leave now. And that's what's going on. He's not playing tricks, but he was following the will of God. God had said, leave, arise, leave. Jacob was doing that. But Laban caught up with Jacob. Laban caught up with Jacob. And the text tells us that he overtook him. The word to overtake is a word that connotes hostile, ill-intentioned pursuit of an enemy during battle. And that's the scene now between this family, that Laban is pursuing him with hostile, ill intentions, like you would another army that you're doing battle against. And that's what he's going to do. He's going to catch Jacob, and he overtakes him. But who is in charge? God's the one in charge. Laban says it's in his power. He has the resources to do evil to Jacob. But Laban has to concede, I'm not the one in charge. Whatever that was like the night before he caught up to Jacob, whatever it was like for God to say to Laban, don't speak good or bad to Jacob. Whatever that event was like, Laban realized he was not ultimately the one in charge. God was the one in charge. Continued obedience by Jacob to the divine will of God, to God's will, resulted in God's intervention and divine protection for him and his family. God had came to Laban in a dream and said, don't say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. Laban said, it's in my power, but the God of your father. Even though he realizes he can't do anything, he actually confronts Jacob. Now, I find this interesting. Look at Genesis chapter 31. Look at verse 26. When he does confront Jacob, listen to the words that Laban says to Jacob. When he caught up to him and he does confront him, he said, what have you done? Does that sound familiar to anything else in the Jacob story that has occurred previously? It's nearly the exact phrase that Jacob said to Laban when he woke up the next morning with Leah instead of Rachel. He went and found Laban and he said, what have you done? It's nearly the exact same phrase. And it's almost like the author of Hebrew, the Hebrew author here of Genesis is saying to us, the irony is incredible here. Laban doesn't understand the meaning of the words that are coming out of his mouth, but he, the great trickster himself, the one who did the switcheroo, who was a part of God's process of allowing Jacob to reap what he had sown, is now the one who is reaping what he had sown. And it's portrayed very vividly in the question, what have you done? Laban doesn't even realize he's simply reaping what he had sown. Jacob, in all of this, we won't get into the details of all that Jacob said, but in all of Jacob's response to Laban, Jacob confesses loudly and clearly that he was preserved and protected by God. He claims all of his wealth is due to God overriding Laban's ill intentions toward him. I mean, Jacob says, Laban, if it wasn't for the God of my father, if it wasn't for the God of Abraham and Isaac, if it wasn't for the God that I served, I would have had to leave you empty-handed. You would have taken everything. Jacob is saying, it's not what I have done, it's what God has done. And Jacob proclaims that very loudly and clearly. And I think it's important for us to know today that as Laban set out on his journey to overtake Jacob, because Jacob was acting in obedience to the will of God, God stepped in and said, no, you cannot. You are not in charge. I am in charge. Jacob is moving and acting in obedience to me. You cannot have anything to do with this. And so we learn this, that opponents who seek to overcome or resist the one who is doing the will of God will ultimately be prevented in their efforts. They'll ultimately be prevented in their efforts. Those who seek to oppose you, when you are living and moving and breathing and acting and behaving in obedience to God's will, those who try to oppose you will not be able to overtake you. They will not be successful in their efforts. God protects the one who obeys him. One of the things I'm doing right now is trying to finish up my Doctor of Ministry degree that I've been working on for about 4.5 years now at Dallas Theological Seminary. And so part of what I'm doing in writing of my dissertation is I'm doing a multiple case study design of successfully revitalized churches. And so if you want to know about how to gather and collect data and analyze that, come talk to me. Any nerds in here about that, I can tell you, because I'm right in the thick of all this right now. If you're interested in that, most of you are not, but I've been doing this. And so one of the churches that I talked to a few weeks ago is a church in North Carolina, and I met with this pastor, and a really kind of interesting story came out of our conversation and meeting and talking about things that were going on. And one of the things that interesting that came out of this was something that he told me that I thought was interesting. They kind of have this saying and this phrase in their church that's become popular in their church is God over country. God over country. So what does that mean? I thought this was really interesting. What he told me was, he said one of the things he realized was, and they're super patriotic. They're super patriotic. I mean, they're probably a little more patriotic of a church than what we are. Even they're very involved in things like that, and they stand behind the country and all of those things, and they support. But God comes first. God comes first. He said we made that very clear. God over country. We're loyal, we're patriotic to our country, but God comes first. He said, one of the things I realized was, as I started looking back at kind of the problems that we're experiencing in our culture today, in American culture, a lot of it, he said, he felt like was due to the fact that there was a generation of Christians that put country ahead of God. 1962, and we're told, hey, officially sponsored prayer and the Bible, can't have that in public school anymore. Most Christians, there might have been some battles, there might have been some fighting and resistance to this, but most Christians, okay, that's what the government says, we'll do it. We'll just go along with that. We'll go along with that. And so he said, I really felt like as I've analyzed some of this, that a big part of the problems we're experiencing in our society and culture today is because we've put country over God. Now you think about it, it is a far cry. No prayer in schools. Can't pray in the name of Jesus. Okay, Christians say by and large, okay, we'll go along with that. That is a far cry from Acts, the book of Acts, when the disciples were preaching and teaching about Jesus, and they were whipped and beaten and thrown in jail, and then they were released and they were said, now you can go free, but you can't talk about Jesus anymore. And they said, okay. No. They said, hey, listen, you can do what you have to us. You do what you have to us. Do what you have to. But we can't stop speaking and teaching and preaching about what we have seen and heard. And we saw and we heard Jesus. And we're going to keep talking about him. That's far different from, okay. See, one of the things that's interesting, when we face opposition, because we're continuing in our obedience to God, God will protect us in that. God will protect us in that. I think much of what we've done is we just quit our obedience. We just quit our obedience. It's like, Lord, I'll follow you. I'm going to obey you. First obstacle comes up. Okay, that's enough. I'm done. See? It's continued obedience to God that results in divine protection, not quitting. Those who continue in their obedience to God enjoy the blessing of God's protection on their life. You know, we looked at, even in the song we were singing, the worst thing in the world that can happen to you. The worst thing in the world, humanly speaking, in terms of life, is to lose it. God's already promised He'll protect you in that. He'll protect you in that. Opponents who seek to overcome or resist us when we're continuing in our obedience to the will of God will ultimately be prevented in their efforts. Whatever they could mount against us will not stand. And then briefly, let me give you the last part of that. Last couple parts, even from the potential consequences of sin in one's own camp. This is sort of an unusual thing. I don't have time to dig into this very deeply, but this is an unusual aspect of this story. Rachel had stolen her father's household gods. Jacob didn't know about it. He didn't know that had happened. Laban accused Jacob of stealing them. That's the only thing he couldn't answer. Laban accused Jacob of many things to which he could respond and give a strong answer, but that he really couldn't give an answer except search and see. Try to find it. We're not told why Rachel took these. It's interesting to speculate. Why did she take these household gods? And I think there's about 15 texts where the word teraphim, which is used here for household gods, there's about 15 Old Testament passages where that appears. And putting all of that together, we're led to believe it was some type of figurine. Some type of figurine that someone would practice divination through, and maybe that's what Laban was using when he figured out something earlier in the text when it tells us he practiced that. We're not sure why. Like, why did Rachel take these? I don't understand that. We're not sure. Was it spite? Was it greed, security, title to an inheritance? Those things could have been part of it. Was it a sign of patrimony? Was it to prevent her father from going to them to figure out where they had gone? We're not really sure why she took them. But either way, her stealing of them is presented here as sinful. The way it's presented is just like the way Jacob, when he went into his father with the goat's hair and deceived him. We have very similar language. What did Jacob's father do when he came in with the goat's hair earlier on to deceive him? When Isaac was there and Jacob came in, he felt around and he felt him. Same phrasing and imagery is given as Laban goes feeling around through the tents, looking for these household gods. And so Rachel is presented here as having done something equally as detestable as what Jacob had done in deceiving his father. 3 times it tells us that Laban searched for the gods, and 3 times he came up empty. All the while, where were they? In the saddle of Rachel. She was sitting on them. And God, in this, protected Jacob. Laban doesn't find them. Jacob being obedient to him, having sin in his own family, yet unaware of that, and God protecting him, and doing so in a really unique fashion. To be clear, it's not a sin that Jacob knew about. It wasn't like he knew this and he overlooked it. That's different. He was unaware of this, and yet God took care of him through this and protected him. It's interesting, an interesting side note here. Laban's gods are voiceless and powerless. They don't reveal themselves. Like Laban's like trying to find them, and they don't reveal themselves. They don't come out of hiding. They don't assert themselves. In fact, they're presented in a very mocking and humiliating fashion. They're kind of the butt of the joke here. Here is Rachel saying, the way of a woman is upon me. It's that time, okay? And I'd rather not get up. Is that okay? And they're presented as being hidden underneath her. She's sitting on them. These gods are in this, sort of as a side note, being mocked and humiliated as against and opposed to the God of Jacob. Look at the gods of Laban. Look at the God of Jacob who intervened on his behalf. Look at Yahweh, Elohim, the God who has a personal relationship with Jacob, the one who is almighty and all-powerful. He's presented both ways in the text, Yahweh and Elohim. Look at the gods of Laban. It's an interesting side note here. All of this is to say when God intervenes, if I can get that to change, when God intervenes, there is nothing Satan or anything in this world that can stand against him. I mean, if you are living in obedience to his will, you will be taken care of. There's nothing in this world. These household gods of Laban, they can't do anything for him. They can't do anything for him. They're made fun of. They're mocked and humiliated in this text, as opposed to the God that we serve and the God that Jacob served and worshiped. I want to just say this to you for application here practically about this. I want to encourage you, worship the true Lord with your life. Worship the true God with your life. Don't set up household gods and idols that you spend your life worshiping. I'm not talking about putting little wooden figurines in your house, but don't make things of this world an idol and worship and serve it. You'll go like Laban if you do. And I want to say this, when you, like Laban, if you do that, if you set up your own idols for worship, then when you, like Laban, face tragic loss, those household idols won't do you any good. They're not going to do you any good. We worship so many things here in America. We put so many things over God. We spend so much time and worship given the place of priority to other things in this life. And then when we really come to a point where we face tragic loss, those things aren't there. They're not going to be there. God's the only one that's going to be there. Everything else is rendered useless in being there for us. The third thing that we have to respond to quickly is we respond with grateful acknowledgement of God's blessing. Once it became clear that Laban had nothing he could hold against Jacob, once Laban's gods were mocked and humiliated unbeknownst to Laban and unbeknownst to Jacob, God is at work in all of this. Once all of this comes clear in the text, and once Laban realizes he can't find what he thinks has been stolen, he realizes he doesn't even have his gods to protect him. The night before, the God of Jacob had appeared to him and said, "You can't do anything here." Laban says, "Well, he thinks he'll find his gods." He don't find them. Now suddenly, the whole posture of the scene starts to turn, and Laban starts backpedaling. And Laban goes into, let's make a peace treaty mode. Let's make a peace treaty mode. Laban gets clear, it becomes clear to him that he's not going to be protected by his gods. Jacob's being protected by Yahweh. He won't have his for protection. He has to go into self-protection mode. He has to draw up this peace treaty and this pact in order to make sure that Jacob never comes back against him again. And they set up these stones and they put together this treaty. And Laban says in this treaty, here's the way the treaty will work. I'll never pass these to you to do you harm. You can never pass those to come to me to do me harm. And they set up this covenant and this agreement. And it's interesting, after Jacob finishes talking to Laban and giving his defense, and Laban, after he realizes his gods are nowhere to be found and they won't come out for themselves, when this becomes obvious, Jacob realizes his God is going to take care of him. And throughout the rest of the story, as Laban works to set up this pact and this peace treaty, and he goes into the verbiage and the language of all of this and drawing it up and what should happen and not happen and how we should agree to it, you know, Jacob only speaks two more words. After verse 42, the rest of the scene and the chapter, Jacob only speaks two more words. And it's in verse 46 when he tells some of his servants to gather stones, to gather up stones. In verse 46, he just says to his kinsmen, gather stones. And then they took them and they made a heap, and they ate there by the heap. This is unusual for Jacob. Here's a legal document being drawn up. The master, deceiver, and manipulator, the one who has tight-fisted his way through life, is loosening his grip because he's realizing God is taking care of me. I mean, years earlier, can you see this same Jacob going, whatever you want to put in the agreement's fine? No, he won't just be sitting, he wouldn't have been sitting back letting this happen. He realizes God's in control. God is the one that's protecting him. And all he does is respond in giving grateful thanks to God. They set up an altar. They offer a sacrifice. He agrees to the oath. It doesn't give us his words. It just tells him that he does swear to the oath. But the details of it, Jacob's not worried about this anymore. He's not worried about this. He's got the Lord clearly on his side. These two men are moving in two different directions at the same time. There's two throughout the rest of this text. Two stone markers, two names for the pile of stones, two place names, two ritual meals, two conditions in the pact, two invocations of deity, two names for God, two ancestors are named. Laban and Jacob are going in two totally different directions. And Jacob doesn't need to worry about protecting himself. He appears aloof and unconcerned about the details of the treaty. He knows his God will protect him. What he does in his actions and in his defense speech earlier is he loudly proclaims his gratitude to the Lord, attributing all success and protection to him. And so I just close with this. I wonder how often do we fail to credit God? How often do we fail to credit God for the things he has done? God has preserved and protected you in your continued walk of obedience to him. How have you acknowledged that with gratitude? When is the last time you acknowledged with gratefulness the goodness of your God? I mean, this is what Jacob says to us in this scene. God tells us he will protect us. When we continue in obedience to him, he'll protect us. And when he does, all we need to do is respond with grateful, thankful hearts. We need to gratefully acknowledge our God and the blessing of divine protection when we experience it as a result of our continued obedience to him. Would you bow your heads and close your eyes this morning as the band comes to close our service in worship? As the band comes, we're going to sing and we're going to worship the Lord together today. And I want to invite you to make this song a public testimony and an acknowledgement of your gratefulness to the goodness of your God. And when we gather together, listen, when we gather together and we sing, we're not gathering together and singing to point to us. We're not gathering together and singing to try to let everybody know how good and gifted we are at singing. Like, that's not it. If you ever stand near me when I'm singing, you'll know that's not true. We gather together and we sing because we have a great and awesome God who, when we obey him in spite of opposition, he protects us. He watches over us. He takes care of us. And in the midst of that, we just respond with grateful acknowledgement of who he is and what he has done. And so I want to ask you to do that as we sing this morning. Would you stand together? Everybody stand and let's sing and we'll worship the Lord.